Berurah class. I'm a little chilly today. The air conditioning is a little strong in the base measures. So I have a sweater on, but will not keep us back from learning Torah. And we are definitely going to continue. Excuse me. We're definitely going to continue learning about who is exempt from the Shema today. So even though the cold won't stop us, there are reasons why people would not be required to have to recite the Shema, for whatever reason it is. And the cold will not be one of those things. So this Siman 70, chapter 70 in Orach Chaim, we want to know who is exempt from the Shema, and we open with saying that women and servants, so this means even male servants, so women and male servants. So by a servant we mean someone who had been previously non-Jewish. For whatever reason, they either contracted themselves to be a servant in someone's house in perpetuity. They sold themselves as a slave and gave the proceeds to somebody else. Another possibility is that they were born into a slave family and they themselves were then traded on the open market. So this is back in the day when slavery was still common. And so a person who was a slave, even though they were converted to Judaism, they were started off not Jewish, they were converted basically without accepting the mitzvos upon themselves. The mitzvos are imposed upon them. So that's the difference between a non-Jewish slave conversion and a conversion for the purpose of being a righteous convert, one who wants to be free and accept the mitzvos as binding upon themselves of their own volition. In a case of regular servitude, you just want the money for the servitude. And so therefore, they are exempt from the Shema, for they are also exempt from any time-bound positive commandment. However, it's still important to teach them that they should accept upon themselves, as binding upon themselves, the kingdom of heaven. Which means at the very least they should recite, the Ramah adds at this point, that they should at least recite the very first line of the Shema. Okay, and so when we say exempt, the Mishna adds even at a rabbinic level. So what does it mean that they're exempt from the Shema? The Mishna explains, so they don't have to say the Shema, they don't have to say the blessings, because technically speaking, the blessings have to be recited in the first quarter of the day, as we have explained earlier in chapter 58, number 6. So the blessing of Emes V'Yatziv might actually be different, because that one was meant to be recited for the remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. And also the blessings following the Shema in the evening are also about remembering the Exodus from Egypt. So these things aren't actually time-bound, and therefore they should be obligated to recite them. So that should be something they should have to do. And it also appears that they should also be required to recite these blessings right before tefillah in order to put the context of the redemption from Egypt right next to tefillah, which we'll learn about more in chapter 106. But we talked about this idea of smichas gula tefillah beforehand, of putting these blessings right next to the Shema. We learned about this already a few chapters ago. So the one answer as to why this isn't an obligation is because some people say that the remembering the Exodus from Egypt is really only a rabbinic mitzvah, and they just placed it upon they placed it upon a verse to give it more strength. And so really there is a daytime component to it, and it is time bound, and therefore they are exempt from it. And it's entirely possible that there is a rabbinic requirement to recite it. And this is repeated by a number of other achronim as well, another other commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. And the most prominently, the Sefer Shagas Aryeh, he says that women are exempt because each mitzvah of remembering the Exodus from Egypt one's for the daytime, one's for the nighttime. They're each a separate mitzvah, and therefore they are completely exempt from it. So we said earlier that Mishna Berurah points out that Sukkot Zimra is also exempt from that. However, since they should not be exempt from that because it is meant to connect to prayer, and therefore women and servants should have to recite Sukkot Zimra, and then they can go into the prayer service into the Shemona Esrei. And the other morning blessings seem to be predicated on prayer and are only a rabbinic requirement and not necessarily time bound. But we did say that since you can only say them during the daytime, we said this before in chapter 52, that they may be exempt from it and you wouldn't have to say it. Okay, but the Levush, who's the commentary that is a student of the Ramah, he says women and servants should recite them. So this is only a question about whether they should be taught that they have to do it, or if they want to accept it upon themselves. If they want to accept it upon themselves, exempt they. So when I teach people about prayer, I teach everybody to recite everything. So that way, if you have time, the only difference would be is that for women, if they don't have time, they can rely on these opinions to be lenient on themselves. But for men, they're kind of stuck having to say these things. And one other interesting point about the Mishna Berurah over here, that we said that they should recite at least the very first verse in order to accept the yoke of heaven upon themselves. Some people actually expand that to the entire first paragraph. So that's what he says. But however, the Levush, explaining his teacher's statement, says no, he really only meant the first line. Okay, moving on to the second halacha here. Now, minors are exempt. However, there's a dispute. According to Rabbeinu Tam says they are exempt only until they reach the age of chinuch, until they reach the age of mitzvah education, at which point they would become obligated to recite the Shema and everything. And according to his grandfather Rashi, even if they reach the age of chinuch and they have to be taught these things, they're not obligated to recite them, because it's not always the case that people who are obligated, such as their father, are around them to bring them to shul at the time that they have to recite it, or especially in the evening time that they won't be able to recite it, and they could be sleeping in the morning. So they're going to be going to bed too early for the Kriya Shema at night, and they're going to be getting up too late for the early Shema. And we say, however, it's appropriate to follow the custom like Rabbeinu Tam. So since the child is not with the father, we don't feel it, but we feel that it's important to follow the custom like Rabbeinu Tam. So the Mishna Berurah explains, what is the age of chinuch? That's about 6 or 7 years old. So a father should be teaching their son to do all these mitzvahs, and this is one of them that they should teach them to do. So even though we're saying that they're not obligated, the Mishna Berurah adds that they should at the very least teach the child to say Shema Yisrael on a regular basis, in order that they should know these things. So you should recite it before you go to bed and then first thing in the morning when you get up. So there, even according to the lenient opinion here, the Mishna Berurah points out that by the time a child reaches age 12, you really should be teaching them how to do this. That way they're ready for when they become bar mitzvah. So even though Mishna Berurah says, even though the halacha really seems to follow Rashi, we say that it's better to do Rabbeinu Tam. And that's also not only the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam, it's also the opinion of the Rambam as well. So some people will say that you really should teach them as soon as they become this age to recite the tefillah, because there's more time to recite it basically all day. Okay, halacha 3. So let's talk about somebody who is getting married. He's getting married, and for both him and her is the first time they are married. So they are, and when at this moment they're at this day, this is the day of their marriage. Okay, so that's what we're talking about in this case. So on the day that for two newlyweds, they're on the day of their marriage, and for both of them, this is their first time ever being married, never having a partner. They are exempt. He is exempt. She is exempt because she's a female. He is exempt from the Shema for 3 days until he actually consummates the marriage. Why? Because he's so busy with the mitzvah. We say this is the Iker Halacha. He's so busy with it, he's going to be distracted from the mitzvah. So he's basically he's so involved in the mitzvah, he doesn't want to be distracted by doing anything else. However, the Shulchan Aruch says this was in the early days. Now, people don't even pay that much attention to the Shema. Even in this case, we don't give them this exemption anymore. And the Ramah says, take a look later on it'll take a look before that we say that if a person is drunk, they also don't recite the Shema. Okay, so it's take a look. Sorry, not before. This is in 99, Sadi test. So in 99, if you're drunk, you should not recite the Shema. Okay, so when we say here again, the Mishna says you're not only exempt from the Shema, you're exempt from its blessings. You're exempt from Shemona Esrei, which we'll say that later on in 106. For 3 days and 4 nights, says the Mishna. Okay, so if you get married on the daytime of Wednesday, you don't have to recite the Shema until after Shabbos is over, and that includes Motzi Shabbos. However, if you have already consummated the marriage, you are now obligated again. Mishna explains. And so when we say now that in the second half of here that we have them read it, that means that they're required to recite, the groom is required to recite everything now. Because now if he's required to say the Shema, it's everything. We're not lenient even on rabbinic ones. So when we were lenient before, we were lenient even to not require everything through Shemona Esrei, and now that we're strict to require him to recite it, we're strict for everything, including Shemona Esrei. So, and it even seems to include tefillin as well. Okay, and we say that this is similar to a case of a person who becomes only slightly drunk and they're still somewhat aware of their surroundings. They could still go ahead and pray, even though back in the day they did not do that. Okay, halacha number 4 here. If one is busy providing for the needs of the community and time comes to recite the Shema, one need not recite the Shema now. Rather, they can finish the activity, whatever it is they were doing, and then they can recite it as long as there's time left to recite. So this is an interesting halacha. It's referring to someone who is osek mitzvah, patur min mitzvah. So the question is, how does that work? When we say when you are involved in one mitzvah, you are exempt from another. The question always is, just because you have a mezuzah on your house and you're wearing tefillin does not mean you are exempt from other mitzvahs. So the Mishna explains that this case is where you have nobody else who can fill in for you. It falls on your shoulders, and therefore you are considered an osek b'mitzvah. And even if you're only doing a case, let's say there's a case where there's financial loss and you're stopping a fire, for example, you're a firefighter, right? That would be a reason why you're exempt, because a fire came suddenly at night and the break of dawn comes. But we're saying this is only if you don't have time you still have time to recite the Shema, because if you don't have time, it seems like you should stop. So the Mishna explains that if you started when you were already obligated at the time of the Shema, then you would need to stop. However, some people disagree and say that you need not stop if you haven't recited it, but became absorbed in another mitzvah. And if you were able to take a break from what you're doing and recite the Shema, and then go back to what you were doing for the community, then you must stop. So even though we say that someone who is engaged in communal needs is exempt from the Shema, if you went ahead and stopped, then of course you fulfilled the obligation. It's not like the mitzvah was not there at all. This is not an actual exemption from the mitzvah. What it's trying to say is that you need not stop from one to go to another. All mitzvahs have equal importance. And so the Mishna says, if you were to pause for a moment and say the first line of Shema, within the proper time, then that would be okay, even in the middle of engaging in the needs of the community. Now, technically, you should have to stop to focus a little bit on that. So he says another thing to think about over here: when there's time, you should go ahead and stop what you're doing to recite the Shema. However, if there is no time, because you were busy dealing with a communal need, you should still go ahead and recite the blessings and other parts of the mitzvah, because you have Yetzias Mitzrayim, even after the time of Kriya Shema. You still have to mention the exodus from Egypt, and since they're separate mitzvahs, you should therefore go ahead and recite the blessings, and also recite the parsha, the third paragraph that has exodus from Egypt in it, especially if the time for Shema has passed. And again, still the daytime, the first half of the day, where you can still recite the blessings like Emes V'Yatziv. And we explained this earlier in chapter 58. And so, if you're really engaged in this public and communal need for a long time, that takes you past halfway through the day, and you haven't stopped for anything, and then you would be exempt from everything, from the Shema, from exodus from Egypt, nonetheless. You are still not allowed to go ahead and sit down and have a meal until you have put tefillin on, because now tefillin would be the next most urgent mitzvah, because that mitzvah is all day long, and so therefore you'd have to do that first, and you'd also have to daven mincha first before you sit down and have a meal. So if you keep working until 1/2 hour past the middle of the day, then you should daven mincha first, and then you can go ahead and eat. But if you stop in between the halfway point of the day, right, the zenith point of the sun, and then afterwards, you could actually eat in that small time period. Okay, last halacha today. Let's say you were busy eating, or you were taking a bath in the bathhouse, or you were getting a haircut, or you were tanning some skins, or maybe you were busy in a court case. According to the Rambam, you can go ahead and finish it and then recite the Shema. And if you're concerned that you're going to pass the time of the Shema, then you should stop and recite the Shema, and that's preferable. However, the Raiva disagrees and says you must stop now to recite it, even though there's still time left. So what is this dispute? So these things are considered permissive activities. You can do them. So, but the issue is you have to start them at a time when it's permitted to start them. So that halacha of when can you start to eat, when can you start to do this, when can you start to do that, is discussed later on in the Shulchan Aruch and Mishnah Berurah in Siman Reish Lamed Beis, in the halachas of Mariv and Mincha. It's in 232 too. It's in laws of Mincha. They're not allowed to do it, and also it's also discussed a little bit about Bedikas Chametz in Siman Tuf Mem Beis. So the Rambam holds you finish, because I'm going to take X amount of time and then I'll go daven. So that's fine. You're allowed to do that. And if you're concerned that it's taking too long, you're going to pay attention to that. However, the Raiva disagrees. And the Mishnah Berurah points out, Most people agree with that. So everyone says that you really should fulfill your Torah level mitzvah first, and then start with something else. Whether it started in a permissive manner or an impermissible manner. And so therefore, in all these cases that we mention here, except for eating, if you started them before the break of dawn, Amud HaShachar, which we said was the earliest time you can start reciting the Shema, then you would not need to stop if you have time after you finish your work to recite the Shema. Because we say later on that they didn't make such a rule of stopping your work when it's at the first hours of the day. This is in 89:7. So there was no rule against that, only later on by mincha time. And so if you started at that point, that would be permissible to finish before reciting the Shema. But if you start doing stuff after the daybreak, which we call Amud HaShachar, Sha'al Amud HaShachar, which is not permissible because you must go ahead and recite all of the tefillahs in the morning, you must stop to recite the Shema because that is a Torah mitzvah. But the blessings and tefillah, you wouldn't have to stop for them. And so therefore you could go ahead and finish the work, recite the Shema with their blessings, and say Shemona Esrei. Because you have enough time. But if there's not enough time, and it looks like you're not going to have enough time, then you must stop what you're doing and go say these things. And even though you're going to miss the time of public prayer, apparently it doesn't seem that you're obligated to stop. Now, eating is different, points out the Berurah, because we say later on that you have to stop eating as soon as the day breaks. We say this in chapter 89. You have to stop because there's a separate prohibition from eating, even if you started during the nighttime. And so therefore, you have to stop because there's a prohibition on eating at this time. The other thing that Berurah points out over here is that when we say that you go ahead and recite according to the Ravid, what we're saying is that. One second, I lost my place here. So once you recited the Shema, even though you haven't said Shemona Esrei, you could finish all of these things. After we just mentioned that. And even though the Ravid says to stop, he's only referring to stopping for the Shema. As long as there's time, you could drag out Shemona Esrei. Or, this was a leniency that was extended only for the evening prayer, because you could get dragged out in something and then fall asleep. And so therefore, you should try to get it done, especially if you have time within the half an hour or so before the stars come out. It says when you're obligated to recite the Shema in the evening. And if that's the case, then you should stop at that time, go and recite the Shema, and then you can return to these tasks. Another option is to recite Mariv early in that same half an hour, and then repeat the Shema later on, which would also be acceptable according to his opinion. Why? Because you might become overly involved in them, explains the Berurah, and you'll miss the Shema. And so this is a little bit different than what we say later on in the rules of having to not start these things when time of Mincha rolls around. Because if you start in these things in the morning time before the Mincha time, then you don't have to stop. But that's only because that's a rabbinic mitzvah to recite the Shemona Esrei. But here we're talking about the Torah level mitzvah of Kriya Shema, so therefore it's different. And the most important thing is to navigate the difference between starting when you're allowed to start and as opposed to starting when you're not allowed to start. So if you start at a time when you don't have the obligation of the mitzvah yet, whether it's the Shachris obligations or the Mincha obligations, then you could drag it out. However, if you started doing something while you have these other obligations, then you have to stop for everything. And these exceptions that we make are only when you were starting in a permitted time, but because of the fact that you might become drawn out, you'll miss the time for the mitzvah, Torah level mitzvah. Thank you for coming out today to class. We'll see you next time with more laws of the Shema. Have a wonderful day.